I think Central Eastern Europe is a success story that you have not seen anywhere else in the world in the last 30, 40, 50 years. You don't get lucky if you don't work hard. Look at Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe as an area of opportunity rather than risk.
Welcome to Banking on Success, our podcast where leaders and experts share their stories about CEE and beyond. My name is Elica Kavrakova, Group Head Institutional Clients, and I have with me
Daniel Rath. I'm responsible for corporate customers in RBI.
In this episode, we have a very special guest, Mr. Franz Hörhager, the founder of Accession Capital Partners, a company that redefines mezzanine investment and private debt in CEE. Franz is no stranger to change. He moved from the world of banking into the exciting world of private equity and debt. Today, we would like to deep dive with him into how he navigates these complex markets and what he foresees for the future of investment in emerging regions. Franz, at the beginning, I would like to ask you, and also for our audience, can you share with us where did you start your career? And how did it evolve ever since? And what I will be particularly interested to hear from you is what were the turning points or the key points which made you make the career change?
Yeah, first, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I'm no stranger, not only to the banking world, but also to the Raiffeisen Group. And I have been involved with your organization for quite a few decades. I'm Austrian. I started out studying in Vienna and trying to make money during my studies. And I was a driver for a company in Vienna that had a representative office in Moscow. And at that time, I drove people to the Vienna airport and picked them up. And at one point, I got interested in the language, of course, because the people told me about Russia at the time. It was not Russia, of course, it was the Soviet Union. We're talking about late 70s. And one day the boss asked me whether I could help to set up an exhibition in Moscow and be there to put up the stand and to help organize things. And for that, they wouldn't give me money, but they would finance a language course for a month in Moscow. Both I did. So I got exposure to a completely different world, the Soviet world at the time. Many of our listeners and watchers will probably not have the chance to remember that. But it was interesting. It was the confrontation with a completely different thought system, and people were still living there. It was interesting to do that. And while I studied at the Vienna University for economics and trade, I think you would translate it, it was then clear that I would write my dissertation about Gosplan, the planning authority, the 5-year plans. So the topic of the dissertation was called Export Marketing in the USSR. And for that, I spent 1.5 years in Moscow, just shuttling back and forth and working for this company because I had to make money all the time. And then I was trying to find a job, and another Austrian bank was looking for someone who had international experience and spoke Russian. And that's how I got the job. It was the only qualification, and that's how I became a banker. So I started at the bank in 1981. And of course, I was the Mr. Eastern Europe. The stamp was very clear on the forehead.
Sounds very familiar.
But this was a very small crowd because when you went to Bratislava from Vienna, it took you 1.5 hours to cross the border because people were checking with big mirrors under your car whether you smuggle people in and out. And so it was a very different world. But I was always fascinated how people in Central Eastern Europe still had the optimism to work, because the system was clearly not made to work hard or to be ambitious. You had a fixed job, but you didn't actually progress. And I became a manager for Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe at the time at that bank. And then I had a great boss. I think it's always good to have a mentor. And this great boss said, you should also get the other side. So I was given the opportunity to go to the United States for that bank. I ran a rep office in San Francisco for 3 years. And then I took over the branch of that bank in New York. So I spent almost 6 years in the US. And what did we do there? Because nobody was waiting for an Austrian bank in New York to lend money to Chrysler or to IBM. There was ample supply. So we introduced export finance to Eastern Europe, to the Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact countries. And we became one of the leading export financiers to finance US exports to that region. And that kept me in touch. It was a big strain on the family because I had to go every 2 months from San Francisco to Moscow and then from New York to Moscow. So the children grew up with big photos on the wall. This is Daddy. But fortunately, my wife was kind enough to tolerate that. And I made an effort to be as much home as possible. And then I was called back into the headquarters after these 5.5 years and worked in the international division, mostly on the credit side, risk side, credit side. So I became a chief risk officer for international, and I was, of course, always concentrating on Central and Eastern Europe because that was considered my expertise.
So I hear now that you've been moving from the business side to the risk side. And what then triggered the decision to move on the institutional investor side and to create, it was, the company had another name beforehand, now is ACP. This is a different world partially from the commercial banking. So what was triggering that move?
What I described to you was still during my banking career. But this bank underwent some mergers. And, in mergers, there are always two groups of people. The ones who are sort of the politicians and they do very well. They sit at their desk and they take the chainsaw and try to cut somebody else's chair. And the others who are still out there at the clients. And I was at that time in the managing board of that bank. And I was responsible for the international network. And I was in Singapore and I was in New York and in Tokyo. And when I came back, I didn't have the time and the energy to play the political role. So for me, it was the right time to then say, I will change the job or the career. I was early 40s. So probably the last time when you go on your own. I think while you have a 4 in front, that's the last time. When you are 50, you are usually settled. And then I had a wonderful friend in London who was a client of the bank. And he had started the first mezzanine fund in the UK. At that time, I had no idea what mezzanine was. I thought it was in the building, between the ground floor and the first floor. And here in Vienna, we have that a lot. But it was not it. Although you can compare it to a building because in a corporate finance structure, the ground floor is the equity. And the first floor is the senior debt that you provide. And there is something in the middle. And that's the mezzanine financing that we provide. So we, from my banking point of view, we invested in that mezzanine fund in the UK. And that guy then, who became a close friend, encouraged me. I said, you are such an expert in Eastern Europe. There's zero mezzanine in Eastern Europe. Why don't we together start something in the mezzanine space in Eastern Europe? And that's why in January 2000, so exactly 25 years ago, I started what was then called Mezzanine Management Central Europe, and which is now called ACP.
congratulations also to the anniversary then, huh? It's 25 years, close to, a little bit later now. Probably we know what you're doing and where you're in. Probably for the audience, can you give us a little bit of insight what ACP is up to at the moment, which businesses you're doing, and also geographically, you said Central Eastern Europe is the area you are working with. What are the drivers of ACP?
Yeah, we changed the name actually a few years ago from Mezzanine Management to ACP. ACP stands for Accession Capital Partners, and that already describes the area that we do. I'm a big fan of the European Union. Central Eastern Europe has benefited tremendously from the accession, and we had the foresight, I must say, in 2000 to call our first fund Accession Mezzanine Capital. So we had the mezzanine name, but we also had the accession name. Although in 2000, none of these Central East European countries was a member, right? The first one was 2004 with Poland, Hungary, Czech, and so on, and the Baltics. But we were of the clear view that accession would happen. And accession happened. And I think Central Eastern Europe is a success story that you have not seen anywhere else in the world in the last 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, one of the pillars or the cornerstones on the banking side was running this bank, for many, many years. Herbert Stepic was an icon, or is an icon of these markets, and he contributed tremendously to that. We thought that banking in Central Eastern Europe was not at the level where it should be because of the development of the countries, and more sophisticated banking products and corporate finance products are needed because you had senior loans and you had some equity, actually very little equity, but some definitely senior loans because all the Western banks came to Central Europe and acquired local banks, but there was nothing in between. There was no mezzanine level. So we were the first ones. I had hundreds of presentations in the early 2000s explaining to companies, to lawyers, to the accountants, to the industry bodies what mezzanine is and what it can do for you. Because it is really an instrument in the middle between equity and debt. So we provide loans to companies. We only do SMEs, so we don't go to the big names. Big names are in good hands with Raiffeisen and some of your friendly competitors. But we go, up to sales of, let's say, 50 million euros, a little bit more sometimes, and EBITDAs of single-digit EBITDAs. That's what we do. And there is a space for companies where they don't get that kind of money. And because we are always subordinated to the banks in terms of risk, so banks always like us because they see us almost as equity. But because of that, we are, of course, more expensive. And we always ask for a little equity kicker. That means at the exit, and only then, we get sort of a success fee in form of shares to boost our return. In that way, we share the risk, of course, also with the owner, because if the company doesn't perform well, this equity kicker is worth less or nothing. But if the company has an initial public offering or has a big sale to someone, this little equity kicker can be a lot. And this is how we make money. So that's why we share the upside, but we also share the downside.
So one could say the vision of ACP, RBI, and the EU was basically the same, going into Central Eastern Europe, developing business there.
I think we as Austrians always had a special, not only cultural understanding, but also behavioral understanding. We all grew up with what was called the Iron Curtain. I guess most of your viewers and listeners have probably been born after that. But it was a very tough time for our friends in Central Eastern Europe. And the Austrians were always the meeting point and the melting point. My wife's family had a Czech name, and others have a Hungarian name, and others have a Bulgarian name, and this is something very normal, very, very common, I guess. So the understanding of our neighbors was, I think, in Austria and especially in Vienna higher than from Germans or French people or Italian people or Brits. And we also followed much more closely how people were trying to have a better life in Central Eastern Europe. This is actually jumping to the presence. In my company, we have, I think, 90% of our colleagues and partners are from the region. And on average, and I want to say on average because it's not generalizing, the people from the region have a better work attitude than many in the West. Not all, of course, but on average, because they saw that their parents had a tough life. They had the Zhiguli in Moscow or the Lada Tiger or whatever, the Dacia in Romania, and they had it when they were young or mid-age, and when they retired, they had the same car.
I'm smiling because I can so much resonate with what you're telling, because my childhood was on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and everything what you say I can just subscribe
and you
to.
had the what was called in Russian the Kommunalная Kvartira, which was a big flat, one kitchen, one bathroom, 4 bedrooms. But in the 4 bedrooms, there were 4 families, And to get out of that, you need to be very ambitious. You need to work very hard, a little harder than the other one, probably. And I think this is still the mindset of this generation, even today. Let's see what the generation after that will do. But I think they have also found out that being in a great organization like the European Union gives them stability in terms of law and rule of law. This is also why our company only invests in member countries of the EU. We also added Serbia and the candidate countries, but the EU provides this framework. Doesn't mean that there is no problem in some countries when you do deals. I mean, who might tell? You have this with your network banks as well. But there is this basic understanding that there is a legal framework. There is a framework of rules and regulations, sometimes too many. We all agree on that, I think. But it's not lawless. And this is, I think, what the EU has brought about. And this is why we should make sure that the EU keeps expanding. I think it's important that we have other joiners as well. After careful consideration, not rushing. But even, in Bulgaria and Romania, the EU, although they joined, I think, 17 years ago, and in 2007, I think, only now you see some of the fruits now coming in, and it takes time to change the legal system, the governance system. When I started, we couldn't find a Big Four company in the SME sector that audited the companies that we invested in. There was just none. Today, there is no SME company, at least not the ones we invest in, that doesn't have one of the Big Four. These are these changes. And when you have a Big Four, it doesn't mean that they can't make a mistake. But the likelihood of making a mistake is so much smaller. And the reliability on contracts that go through, that are agreed, that are also standing up in front of a judge, much, much better. And this is why I think in 10 years we'll probably not speak about Eastern Europe anymore. Hopefully we will speak about Europe, or we speak about Eastern Europe like we speak about Western Europe or Southern Europe or Northern Europe, just as a part of the map. But we see tremendous potential still, and I think you as a big banking organization and we as a small mezzanine/equity debt fund, we're also on the same page.
This is very, very inspirational. And maybe, Daniel, before we raise the questions, because I guess you and me have similar questions on the CE region, a question of curiosity, because I feel this inspiration you have after, I would say, a long professional career. So what is the thing which keeps you so excited now in your current activity, also compared to the time when you were a commercial banker?
I think this is also the question of your entrepreneurial spirit. Somehow, the higher you grow in a bank, and I made it up to the managing board, the less you can decide. That was my theory, at least in the bank where I worked. Right? When I went to Hong Kong, I had two people in the car to the airport in Vienna who wanted to grab me. And the time I landed, there was already the guy who ran the Hong Kong branch at the airport, and I was very tired after a 12-hour flight, and said, and this, and could come here and there. So you didn't even have time to go for 2 hours to a museum or to do anything. And it was also harder to see a customer. I think very difficult to get in front of a customer. You have to go through so many filters, and then you get the sort of the calmed down version. I like, in my business, I go to see the owner. Every deal that we do, I see the owner before we invest, and he's a nice guy or not a nice guy, or so this is this customer experience that I started missing at the bank. Of course, you make a lot of money and you get all the nice little...
And everyone speaks about customer experience, but I guess, what you describe is the real one.
You are not shown the unhappy customer in this role, right? Or at least at that time. Maybe now it's more open because of the dominance of the social media, but at my time, the board guys usually got good messages. And of course, then this was like jumping into cold water to start the company with a secretary after having this huge, nice environment in the big bank. But it was a good experience, and I shaped the company the way I thought it should be shaped. Would I make it different today? Probably a little bit. Yeah, I would concentrate more on certain countries. I would concentrate more on certain industries. But it is what it is, and I'm quite happy to the point where we are. We are seen as good partners by the banks, not just Raiffeisen, but we work with a number of banks in a very professional and sort of eye-to-eye level. We are working with private equity funds, of which there are not enough in Central Eastern Europe still.
Agree.
Still, we need to do more. But this is connected to the size of the market. So this is,
I guess, for many unattractive.
It is still small. Unattractive. But there are already, we have some investors from the US, and the ones who spend the time to analyze the situation in CEE, they also come, and they pick up very interesting companies. And on the other hand, these companies then have the necessary capital to grow, because there is not enough FDI inflow in many cases in this SME sector. And the SME sector is the backbone of the corporate development in these economies.
You were already before, and now again touching market sentiment. You have offices next to Vienna, in Warsaw, Bucharest, Budapest, Prague as well. Any difference also on the regions, the countries where you say current market environment? How strong do we see it? We see Western Europe more and more troubling, Germany difficult, Austria difficult, whereas as we also in research see that Central Eastern Europe still stable developments. Is there a difference how you see it at the moment? Countries, areas that are better performing than others where you are working in?
Yeah, Central Eastern Europe, as we all know, is not is a geographical region, but it's very different countries. I think all of them have the benefit from this EU membership. and the accession. It is coming down to cultural aspects, as it is in Western or Southern Europe. It's the negotiation atmosphere in Bulgaria, Romania is probably similar to Italy and Spain. In all positive.
I can confirm.
I just wanted to ask you if this is something.
I so much resonate here.
So that's my theory. Is in 10 years we'll speak about Northern and Southern Europe. Probably.
Oh, okay.
And it's good as it is, but it's very different. On the other extreme, the Baltic countries, which I really love, they have an unbelievable success story. Other countries in Central Eastern Europe have had the negative experience of communism 30, 40, 50 years. Yeah? But the Baltics were snapped up 80 years, 90 years ago. So the problem, I think, is that you had the system change in the Baltics much longer than in Central Europe. And that's why it was so much harder for them to adjust to the free market economy. And this is also, I think, why it's so amazing how they changed their attitude. And if I compare the Austrian e-government status on a level from 1 to 10, and we are probably at 5, I would say the Baltics are at 8 or 9. And to see this attempt to work so hard. You had the great financial crisis. In 2009, the Baltic countries made a radical program to save, even with cuts in salaries and pensions. And there was a terrible austerity program, and people were really suffering, which was bad. But they came out much faster. The willingness to reform, I think, is in the Baltic countries was the highest. Poland does a great job. Also now, of course, supported with the government that has come into power, which is a very market liberal government. And we see, I think, the biggest growth in Poland, economic growth in Poland. Also in the north, you have a very, very high entrepreneurial spirit among the young people. It's also easy to set up a company. I think in Latvia, it takes an hour and costs maybe 100 euros. So.
Which for Austrian circumstances, I guess, makes
a little bit longer.
Yeah.
A little bit more costly.
Big difference,
and not on a Friday afternoon. Yeah? So this is the big difference. On the other hand, of course, these are very small markets, and that's a setback for them, because they're just not on the radar for many international investors. So they miss out. Look at the stock exchanges. Yeah? I mean, Warsaw is the leading one, and fortunately we see some activity now. But the rest is I wouldn't say non-existent, but in
Sleeping.
a dormant.
Very dormant.
Very dormant. It's also a problem of Austria, because we are also not big enough. So the money follows the bigger deals. But that would be my assessment. So it's culturally, but it's not east-west. It's more the north-south culture.
Yeah, tend to agree here. And you've mentioned before about the challenges which you faced in CEE. You mentioned legal framework and even not being able to find a Big Four company for auditing. Now, looking forward or currently, what do you perceive as the biggest challenges currently in the CEE region or in different countries in doing the business or generally?
I think the hope is that there will be more members of the euro. So it's a challenge, but it was rather an opportunity. The funny thing is also, as we always argue when we go fundraising, when we are in Asia and we explain why Central Europe, or in the US and we explain why Central Europe, the Maastricht criteria, which in Western Europe nobody cares. Or say, yeah, we should. You had the only ones that fulfill the Maastricht criteria, now not all of them, but more, are the countries of Central Eastern Europe, right? Because they want to join the euro. There are other countries that have joined the euro and have, from the day of joining, never fulfilled the Maastricht criteria. I won't mention any names, but the sun is shining down there. Yeah? So we have they really believe in the euro, and you see, I mean, the Czech Republic is basically on a stable path to the euro. Bulgaria has a fixed exchange rate. Yeah.
Yes, and planning to interest the euro, although what I perceive, locally is that the population is, of course, with every euro introduction, which happened in other countries as well, pretty insecure. So you mean that euro is something which is of advantage?
It's very important because it takes away the swings, and the swings are always creating uncertainty. It can go against you, it can go in your favor, but it's not good. But I think this will happen. Poland is also, of course, on a good way. The other challenges is, of course, workforce. We have I think the trend of people leaving the countries and work somewhere else has more or less come to a halt in many countries because it's not better to work abroad anymore. So we see in Bulgaria and Romania quite a few people coming back because the population has shrunk in the last 10, 15 years.
True.
Also in Poland, but in Poland, first, a lot of people come back because salaries are now almost approaching the EU average, or they are in many cases. And Poland had, of course, the benefit of many Ukrainians replacing the low-cost jobs that Poles wouldn't do. But this is a big point, is the lack of workforce.
Yeah, and the brain drain, which I'm afraid, I'm happy to hear your view saying that people are returning back. I hope it will remain like this.
Yeah. We see this a lot. But we see it in the more qualified jobs, of course, because many of them have studied abroad. Yeah, like Mr. Soros, great to have, and he's not the only one, the philanthropist who gave people the opportunity to study somewhere, but they come back. They set up their own businesses. But you also need the masses of workforce, and this is what
is still lacking.
What is lacking, and I think we all in Europe we suffer under the underproduction, or whatever you call it, of children. Yeah? We don't have enough children. This is a big problem. We are below, and question is how to replenish that. But the key thing, I think, is that you create circumstances where people don't want to leave the country, because nobody really wants to leave their home country, I think, if you are not forced, right? I mean,
back then I left to Austria for studying, but I can confirm that, of course, the connection to the own country keeps being very, very strong.
And so if you get a decent salary and you are treated in a good way, then you rather stay. Not everybody, but rather, or you come back. And I think this is the trend that we see already in some countries, and the trend will increase.
Thanks for that.
Coming to another trend we have hopefully seen, let's see, within the last years, sustainability in debt financing. You just pointed out you're long in the business as well. Within the last 3-4 years, we were heavily focusing on the topic of ESG, sustainability. Now with also the changes in the US, let's see where this is going towards. How is your view in Central Eastern Europe? Are there still growth buckets of your investors as well as the companies there investing into sustainability, doing financing also from your point of view as SAP here?
We consider the ESG topic extremely important. We have not waited for this government or that government, I think, because we are completely apolitical. But we have 7 years ago, we invested in the largest plastic recycler in the Baltics that we just sold last year. We financed these recycling, the sorting lines for the plastic recycling. We invested in a company in Romania, which is the biggest plastic bottle recycler. And we financed a huge line just for the recycling. So before there was this taxonomy rulings in the EU, because we think when we see the amount of waste, there are opportunities to make a commercial business out of it. So we are not a green fund. We are here to make money for investors. But we also owe something to society. If we find a project that is green and makes money, we should be on it. And Central Eastern Europe has had a very bad track record of especially environmental care. In the communist times, these factories were just put up and they were coal-fired.
It was about fulfilling the 5-year plan.
That was the Vyplnění plána, as they call it. And whether what is coming out without a filter didn't matter. And this is the turnaround only started after the Iron Curtain broke down. So it only 35 years ago. First 5 years nobody cared, but it's about 30 years that this is on the minds. And then, of course, there were not enough resources to invest into environmental topics, which are now there. Also, the EU is financing a lot of that. Another very, very useful application of EU funds. So we have a lady that is the ESG director, and she does nothing but that. But her main job is sort of a teaching job, because we need to convince our portfolio companies that this is important, because we only work via our portfolio companies, and especially in the SME sector, that's difficult. No, they don't have a separate person to look after that.
Yeah.
And usually, you have to talk to the CEO or to the owner and say, and by the way, this is what you also have to be doing. And he said, yeah, but I have my customers and I have my suppliers and I have the market. Leave me alone with this. Yeah? So the preparedness is, I would say, limited. And she has a wonderful way of explaining why it is important. And especially the best argument is when you ever want to sell your company, in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 or in 20 years, the buyer will want to see your track record in ESG. And if you don't implement it now, you will suffer in the future. This is the best argument for people to do it.
Which means that in order to support kind of a positive trend in terms of, climate change, it will not go via ideology, but actually it's the business making it happen, supporting all these sustainability topics, and thus teaching clients and consumers to a certain extent, talking about Eastern Europe in particular.
Typically, I'm a big fan of the market. And when you show people that it makes sense that they do something from a market point of view, and this makes sense, they will do it. And that's why I also think that it will be the same in America, whether it's this direction or that direction. But at the end of the day, we need to protect our environment. And if it makes sense from a commercial point of view to invest in that, how many people you have that do the photovoltaic panels, yeah? But this came out of the ESG movement, right? That didn't come out of the business as such, but now it makes sense, and we all benefit from it, yeah? Also in Eastern Europe.
I'm jumping now to a completely different topic, namely, what would be your one key advice to a young person who would like to make an impact either in commercial banking or in a private debt or equity environment? So what is the one key career message you would give to such a young person?
Check what you like to do. Not everybody is finance. But if you like finance, I would probably not recommend to join a bank. Well,
This is me now. This was not discussed.
This was not discussed. Unless it's a bank that has a career program. But I think, our industry is getting stronger and stronger. So the private debt fund, private equity fund, that's where it's great. Or join a bank and then after 5 years come to us.
This is something I could agree on. Yeah, okay, that's
join a bank and then join us.
So we teach them and then they make career.
Yeah, it seems so.
Yeah,
that's probably
but they do business with you. Don't forget, you have great
Fully
friends.
Agree, so it's a win-win situation.
You have great friends on the business
Sounds
side.
like a good
circular
plan.
economy.
Yeah, circular economy. The other, so to be more serious, I think you can in your job get lucky or unlucky, but you don't get lucky if you don't work hard.
I would be now very provocative with the remark. Looking over my son, sometimes I think he believes that money grows on the trees. So I think we have to do with the generation with a different attitude to work-life balance.
And I respect that, but then you get what you invest, But honestly, the working hard thing is something I've discussed many times with my children, and their children are too young to discuss this. But it is, there's no replacement for working hard. Of course, you can have this brilliant idea that becomes the super thing, but even these guys that got rich and created crypto or created some of this software thing, but they also worked hard on that, although it was their hobby. But that there's no replacement. And in order to be able to work hard, you should try and find something that you like to do, because you will not work hard on something that you don't like. This is also the circular thing. Huh? So, but you can. I think you have in any job a good chance to do that. But try to find something where you can think that after a rough night of going out, you still want to go in the morning to that office or to that job. And you like it.
You like your job. That's at least what I hear now in the last minutes and even hour that we discuss.
Yeah. No, I love my job. It's not my job. It's my job. It's what I love to do. But I also love to see the upbringing of the others. Yeah, because I'm not the one that runs that company. I'm responsible for it, but without the team, there is no ACP. And when you see them grow, quite a few of my colleagues have joined me in 05, 06, 07, 08. So it's quite a long tenure, and they're still there. What I did was I gave away shares. So I think that at a major, it's also unknown in Austria, more or less, or at least not practiced enough, that you let people participate in the success of a company. So
it's not that much in the mindset.
This from employee to owner, this move I think is very important, because people come to the office with a different attitude, and that has worked so far quite well in our company.
We have not spoken so much about work and hard work as well. There is something from your side where you also re-energize. So how do you do outside of work, getting your energy back, that you say after a rough night, as you call it, you like to go back? But is there anything special, or how do you get your motivation and relaxation?
My family comes from Tyrol originally, and I'm trying to be in a mountain place called Kitzbühel quite a bit. And there on the mountain, this is wonderful.
True.
Hiking or biking or skiing. Not now because there are too many people, but it's a little calmer. And I think that's what I like to do. And the other thing, believe it or not, I still like traveling. Yeah, although I'm one of the top customers of the Lufthansa
constantly
group.
In the plane, I guess.
Yeah, but you then see on the business side certain places that you want to explore privately, and you go to Hong Kong on business meetings, but when you go to Hong Kong on a private trip, you discover so many more things, and it's just Hong Kong, but you can spend a week there and discover every day something new, or in the US. So I still like that, but I do less of that, of course. You need at some age, you also need a little more time for recovery. Speaking about Vienna, a ball destroys me. Yeah. And in the old days, we went until 4:30 in the morning to the ball, and at 8:30 we were in the office. So that I wouldn't do anymore.
Things are changing here a little bit as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just thought I can listen for at least another hour. Very, very inspirational. And we've covered so many topics, starting from your career, your passion. I heard it privately and professionally for CEE and sustainability, and how Recreate. Now, coming to the end, what would be your message, just the one message which you would like that our audience remembers from this talk today?
The message is that look at Central Eastern Europe as an area of opportunity rather than risk, despite all the risks. But the opportunity outweighs the risk big time.
Perfect closing words, I would want to say. Thank you very much for taking your time and sharing with us. If you audience are interested in more of those compelling stories out of Central Eastern Europe, please get into our RBI podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Raiffeisen Bank International. Make it happen.